Rain World is a serious and underrated game. Heck, I don't know if I could even call it a game. Rain World is many things: a platformer, a rage, a survival, a simulator game. It's a lot. But most importantly, it is an entire ecosystem. Rain World has many good qualities: the story, the lore, the code, and the creatures. Today, we will be talking about all of these things. But for the sake of a finished summative, this will be a part 1 to the story, that being the characters and lore that add up to the main events. Before we get into the game, let's look into the strings and seams. Rain World doesn't work like other games when it comes to animation. You see, in games like Typo Man, all animation are made manually. This makes the character do certain things like grab, turn, and throw. However, in Rain World, they do it differently. Rain World runs on something called procedural animation. That means that animations are done by code and not by hand, which can allow for objects to bend, flex, and twist, as well as sometimes break. When a character turns around, its head faces in the direction you are moving, and the legs are bending and moving. When your feet push the ground, you move. This makes the world feel all the more alive when a character goes limp for a brief moment when it is stunned by something. Speaking of, let's take a look into the world. The world is a mysterious one indeed. You may ask, why are there pipes? What are these weird shelter boxes? Why are they perfectly vertical poles? Well, that was weird. Well, time to get food. Anyways, that's because this world takes place in a post-apocalyptic-ish world. There are buildings, ladders, and more. In fact, every critter here is evolved from a purposed organism. But we'll talk about that in a bit. I forgot to mention that the world is also made up of regions. Each region leads to a different living habitat and has different creatures that are more common here than anywhere else. It's completely nuts. But enough talk about the critters. Kinda. Let's talk about you. The creature you play as is called a slug cat, despite it being more of a mouse-like critter than a cat. Slug cats, unlike most games, are not really a protagonist nor a hero. Here, they are more or less at the bottom of the food chain, which means survival is really difficult because a lot of animals will want to consume you. Thus, you are heavily adaptive. You are really talented, being a creature that is adaptable to situations such as climbing out of pits, maneuvering past predators, and using specific tools for combat. Combat is special and is required to be learned if you want to survive. Now that we learned about the character, let's talk about the foes. In Rain World, there are lots of foes, down from the lizards down to the... Sorry, had an issue. Here we have the lizard, a basic introduction to predators. This one is a green variant. How original. Lizards have lots of capabilities based on their colors. Green ones are tanky, heavy, but slow. Pink ones are stronger, faster, can climb poles, but are much more frail. Blue ones can climb walls, even ones visible in the foreground, but are so small and weak that green lizards will hunt them. Yellow ones have an alpha and will travel in packs, using telepathy to flank prey. And white lizards camouflage into walls, waiting for their prey to come to them. There are other predators too, even that lizards are sometimes afraid of. That being the not-so-graceful, ferocious vulture. Even the plants are vicious. Some are harmless, but the others are predatory. Meet the pole mimic. Don't see it? Wait 2 seconds. Oh, there it is. That pulsing perfectly vertical stick, that there is a pole plant. Or pole mimic. It pulses its leaves to gather sunlight, and when it notices prey, it tightens up, looking perfectly like a pole to climb on. When a prey stands near it, or grabs it, the plant will reveal itself. as it pulls its prey down to its roots. Be careful, or you will share the same fate. But looky here. Here we see a bunch of leaves drooping down from a stalk. But they aren't hiding at all. That's because this isn't a pole plant. This willow-looking red stalk is called the monster kelp. This vicious vine isn't sneaky at all, but more dormant. But don't get too comfortable. It has the ability to sense movement and vibration. And this piece of kelp is most dangerous when in the water, as it is hard to be silent in the sea. Once the monster kelp senses movement, it'll reach for its prey, and once it grabs a hold of you, you better have some sharpened rebar on you, for it will pull you in as you scream. So many predators and other critters, and they have evolved from something else? Well, now that we learned the world, let's learn its history. Before we get into the rodents, we have to go back. Way back. The world is not like the one that we live in. The world is in a state of undeath, trapped in some sort of rigor mortis. Say, for example, some white lizard got absolutely stabbed by a slug cat. It would come back from the shelter it first woke up in as if it were a dream, in their very own cycle. Like death, like sleep, we wake up. I think I got that backwards. Never mind. Most creatures don't mind this cycle, but one species did. They called themselves the Ancients. The Ancients were sick of this cycle, and wanted a way out. They wanted a way out of it, and wanted to perish in a way that was eternal and rest in peace. If you thought of them as religious, you'd be correct. The Ancients were heavily religious. But to call them death-hungry monks would not be entirely true. They called this form of death ascension, to go beyond the cycle without looking back. Now, the Ancients have tried many tactics, not only going no-fat, but also not sustaining themselves in hopes that resisting natural urges would allow them to ascend, not even hoarding currencies or mating. But nothing seemed to be effective. After some time, they started to dig into the planet for something, anything to use to ascend. Soon they dug deep enough and found something extraordinary. The Void Sea. In this world, instead of a core, the planet itself is in a stalemate of life and death. For the world is constantly expanding, while a golden sea of acid continues to dissolve it. The ancients saw this pond of acidic apple juice and realized this is what they were looking for. The Void Sea dissolved something so thoroughly it didn't come back. It was completely gone from the cycle. So many ancients just threw themselves into this ocean of basically acid and forgot their ways. But there was a problem. Not everyone had ascended that day, but instead they set up a deadline for their global ascension. But as they dreamed, they saw something. They saw ancients, recent ones too, but they were twisted, deformed. They had tentacles forming from their sides, and they had scales that continuously grew and shed, making it seem like it was snowing. They told the truth to the ancients, and it terrified them. These were echoes. Ancients had one requirement to ascend: to be rid of all attachments to the world, whether it be environment, person, or object. They wouldn't be able to ascend properly otherwise. Their body would ascend, but their spirit, inner self, basically who they are inside their own head, would be left behind, an echo of their previous self, a punishment for leaving a world they valued. They called this the Great Problem, among others. Seeing this, the ancients were horrified and immediately doubled down on their religious tradition, playing No Nut November with their whole lives in hopes that they didn't one day turn into a scale-shedding, biblically accurate squid. They called these urges karma. You would better know them as 7 deadly sins, but only 5. These signs of karma were called violence, procreation, gluttony, greed, and self-preservation. These forms of karma were what they thought as to what had prevented them from ascending. So instead, they studied the Void Sea. They soon found out that they could use this uber acid to fuel their engines and power supplies better than anything else they had, and they got to make a lot of machines to toy around with. This allowed them to make things that made their everyday lives easier. But they didn't only make machines, though. Oh no. They were interested in the fauna. Thus, they made purposed organisms. You see, when they needed a way to slice their apples and extract their seeds, instead of making a machine that would do it for them, they would make an animal that would do it for them. They would feed it the apples and they would poop out the seeds and upchuck the sliced apples. They made creatures for all sorts of things: cleaning pipes, disposing garbage, sorting trash. When they made a creature that could record and sustain information, that's when they had a miraculous idea. They decided if they couldn't figure out how to ascend, they could make a computer that would do it for them. But it would require a lot of resources and a lot of water, so that their new machine didn't overheat. But that was no problem for them. So they made many purposed organisms, neuron flies to store and deliver information, worm-like transmitters to collect information and pass it on, and many, many more. Eventually, they got to the infrastructure design. They had to make many parts in order to make this work, but with their technology and purposed organisms, down to even the microscopic level, even deeper, they could do it. They made the legs to support it in the air and to provide them with the water they needed, while keeping majority of creatures out. They made the recursive transform arrays for the process of information and general experiments. The general system bus for the main head of the computer, as well as the puppet chamber. And the memory conflux for the storage and sorting of information and processes, as well as anti-gravital chambers for better transportation and information and matter. And they made chambers for rarefaction cells, a ball filled with antimatter and void fluid to serve as a backup power supply to the computer when power grids were down. And in one last detail, they used their microcomputers to write a taboo. The iterators would never be allowed to self-terminate, and they wrote this taboo into every genome. Soon they made the can, the box for the supercomputer, and inside this box, a chamber for the puppet of the computer to communicate with them in a familiar shape. They called this computer an iterator. It was done, and it was time for a test drive. The computer was soon given a spark of life. Processes whirred up. Anti-gravity chambers initiated. Soon the neuron flies flew around, and information transition worms took their position, passing information all over the can. It had awoken! In the puppet chamber, the puppet arose, like a teenager slowly rising for a school day. Soon after, its sentience was achieved, and it knew what it needed to do, and got to work right away. Pleased by their work, the ancients decided to do it again. They found many bodies of water, made many retaining walls, and in those retaining walls laid many more iterators. They were all given names: no significant harassment, 7 red suns, sliver of straw, and many more. The more iterators, the higher of a chance that they would find the solution. However, they never found the solution. Eventually, the amount of water used by the iterators meant that there was a lot of water vapor in the air. This became a rain problem. A big rain problem. The ground was no longer safe. The rain poured so hard that each drop felt like a bullet, and there were thousands of drops. But they built the iterators in the air for a reason. They suspected that this would happen. They climbed atop the iterators and built cities at the top, though they didn't want every creature or person to drown while down there. They built boxes using microorganisms that could repair themselves despite being crushed by heavy amounts of rain to some extent. These shelters were built, and after that, they retreated to their creations. The ancients were soon more trapped than ever. They had their cities, sure, but they still weren't happy as the days grew longer and longer. As they tried their best to hold on until their creations found a way to ascend safely, but as the iterators searched and searched, they continued to have no luck in finding a solution. Soon the ancients grew tired of waiting, and a day of global ascension was scheduled. And in a mere few minutes, they were gone. Every ancient was gone, dissolved in a bath of void fluid, leaving their creations on their own, with no way to self-terminate.